I'm going to call Matt Ducey in a minute, but I just want to make it clear that while this is the sixth call, it will be regarded as the fifth call to be followed by a full green call, and then we'll get ourselves back onto track again. And the reason for this is pretty obviously that at the point I called Mr O'Rourke, he was the only person who actually called for the call, and that got us slightly out of order. Mr Ducey.
Speaker. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Pleasure and honour to rise in support of the second reading of the Social Housing Reform Transaction Mandate Bill. And I'd just like to comment on that last contributor, Mr Speaker, who spoke constantly about ideology, which I thought was slightly ironic from a party that has no ideology other than what their party leader tells them. Mr Speaker, this bill is not about ideology. It's about pragmatism, it's about listening to the sector involved, and it's about listening to vulnerable New Zealanders. And that's what this government does so well. Already only a few days into the sitting calendar, and here we are supporting the increased provision of social housing, just like the increased provision of GP care to under 13s, raising parental leave from 16 to 18 weeks, increasing benefits by $25 a week on the 1st of April. It's because this government cares about vulnerable New Zealanders. The opposition will tell you they care, but they are the ones stuck in ideology. They're the ones who have a litany of failed social policies. We don't mind thinking and thinking and thinking, and then thinking what works. And what we know, Mr Speaker, is that the government doesn't need to be the sole provider of state housing. And that's what this bill does. It allows the Minister of Finance and Housing to have the mandate to transfer the assets to the social housing sector. And it was very clear by the amount of submissions we got. I mean, Mr O'Rourke can speak as much as he wants, and so can Mr Prosser. They weren't in the select committee. We were. We only had 11 submissions. The sky didn't fall in, and actually I agreed with all those submissions because they fundamentally said we need more social housing. Where we disagree is I believe we can develop a mixed economy of social housing, government, which will always be the primary provider, social housing, community housing, and it just goes on and on. We've seen that when you look at the statistics, and you might want to listen to this, Mr Prosser, currently in Housing New Zealand, with one-bedroom units, the demand is 25%, whereas the supply is 9%. Housing New Zealand three-bedroom, the demand 24%, where the supply is 43%. It's very clear. What we need is the right house, the right size, at the right time, the right location, to the right people. And that's what this social housing reform will provide. We know many in social housing have complex needs, and by bringing in community housing providers, they will provide wraparound services to people to support them in becoming more productive and gaining the lives that we want. So well done to this government for stepping up and supporting vulnerable New Zealanders, Mr Speaker. Not only is this bill, Mr Speaker, about supporting vulnerable people, what we want to ensure, Mr Speaker, is that anyone who wants to access social housing, we know there's thousands on the list waiting and ones who want to transfer as well, and that's why I support this bill and commend it to the House. Thank you, Mr Speaker.